Hello, my name is Mike Moyle, and I'm the historian at the IDESST Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center. On July 14, 2023, I gave a presentation at Tiburon Town Hall that was associated with the recent dedication of the Tiburon Portuguese dairy mural wall that you can see here on the slide. We'll be talking more about that wall in just a moment. The event at Tiburon was also to open an exhibit of paintings by João de Brito, who is a local California artist whose work was captured on the azulejo portion of the dairy wall mural. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. I wanted to record this version of my presentation in part to be able to share the history of the Portuguese immigration here to Marin and their involvement with the dairy industry, and also to share some of the background of the effort that went into the creation of the dairy wall mural itself. That was not part of my actual presentation at Tiburon, but I thought it would be of interest. This is another view of the wall at the top. As you can see at the bottom, it's located where the star is on the old rail trail in Tiburon, adjacent to Tiburon Boulevard, and just across Tiburon Boulevard from Del Mar Middle School, which was the site of the Little Reed Dairy, as we'll get into a bit later. It's hard really to imagine today when you see the beautiful wall with its Portuguese tiles and calçada mosaic, what it was when it started. And happily, we do have a picture of it from the earliest days when it was just a concrete block wall. The project really came about as the result of a collaboration between two Tiburon residents, Vasco Moraes on the left here, and Nora Nogues, who are neighbors and ran into each other one day. Nora was the head of the Tiburon Heritage and Arts Council. Vasco was actually our past president at the Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center and has a great interest in Portuguese culture and tradition. They needed to do something with this wall to beautify it, and Vasco had suggested this idea of a mural that would incorporate a couple of different types of Portuguese art form. And here they are. One is a tile called azulejos in Portuguese, and the second is a stone mosaic called calçadas in Portuguese. If you go to Portugal, you will see these all over the place. The tiles are used both externally on structures and internally in homes and buildings. They can be both geometric designs as well as you can see here at the upper left, copies of paintings or other figures that are reflecting perhaps some aspect of Portuguese history. The mosaics tend to be the stone mosaics, are pavements, which are seen here at the top in Cascais, which is Sausalito's sister city in Portugal. But it's only limited by the imagination of the artist as to the forms that can be captured in those mosaics. So the top part of the wall was it intended to be an azulejo tile image. And as the starting point, they selected a photograph that you'll see here at the upper left of the Little Reed Ranch taken in 1931. That's Tiburon Boulevard, snaking through it. A little later in the presentation, we'll see a picture of this same picture compared to the view today. But Vasco had contacted João de Brito, the artist, and had asked him to participate in the project. So the first thing was for João to create a painting that captured the sense of the dairy there, which he did quite beautifully initially, and then he was asked to expand it, as you can see at the bottom, to fit the dimensions that were intended for the dairy wall. And after João had created the painting, they digitized it, and then they sent it to a company in Aveiro, in the central part of Portugal, the Aleluia Cerâmicas company, where they took the painting and then basically replicated it onto, first by painting it again, and then using that as a basis for the tile preparation. Then those tiles were fired, cut up, and sent back to Tiburon to be mounted on the wall. In addition to the actual representation of the painting of the Little Reed Ranch, you can see there. Around that is a set of tiles that are intended to evoke the railroad history of Tiburon. As I mentioned earlier, the mural wall sits right on the old rail line that came into Tiburon, today the old rail trail there. The second part of the project involved the calçadas, and for that they first needed the stones. There were three colors of stones: a black, a white, and a yellowish peach color that were sourced from quarries in Portugal, both in Fátima in central Portugal and in the Algarve down at the southern end of Portugal, as you can see in the map here. Then it was necessary to find an artisan who could install the calçada, install the stones to create the mosaic. A few years ago, the gentleman you can see here kneeling, whose name is Marcos Paulino, had come from Cascais to Sausalito to work on the calçada that you will find at the Praça de Cascais in downtown Sausalito, the compass rose design there. And Vasco was able to get Marcos to come back for this project. And so you can see him working with his assistant, a local assistant, Deo Rocha, on the project, which was done under the most challenging of circumstances, because it was during one of our atmospheric rivers, and the working conditions were really, really challenging. But Marcos and Deo pulled it off, and as you can see, the beautiful result there at the lower right. There's been quite a bit of celebration associated both with the groundbreaking of the project in September of last year and the dedication just last month in June. Last year, the president of Portugal, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, happened to be in California, and he came to participate in the groundbreaking, as you can see at the upper left. Then in June, another delegation, including representatives both from the central Portuguese government and the Azorean government, came to participate in the dedication. And you can see here the Portuguese Secretary of State for European Affairs, Tiago Antunes, cutting the ribbon at the dedication. So I'm now going to talk a little bit, focus on both the Portuguese immigration to Marin and the involvement that they've had in the dairy industry that the dairy mural wall celebrates. Virtually all the Portuguese who came to Marin came from the Azores, or it's called in Portuguese the Açores, which in Portuguese means hawks, which were some of the birds apparently that they spotted when they first arrived in the islands, and as you can see is included in the regional flag of the Azores there, with the golden hawk with the 9 stars representing the 9 islands of the Azores. João de Brito, the artist, actually comes from São Miguel, the island you can see here at the lower right. But most of the immigrants who came to Marin in the early days came from this one island of São Jorge, which is a long, skinny island about 30 miles long and not very wide, for reasons that we're not completely sure of, but it does appear that São Jorge had a real connection, particularly with southern Marin. Of course, in other parts of California, you would find immigrants from virtually all 9 of the islands, as well, of course, as from Madeira, which is another part of offshore Portugal that you can see here. So why did the Azorians come and how did they get here? But for whales and the New England whaling industry that started in the 1700s, it's unlikely that there would be any Portuguese here in California today. Due to the currents and so forth, as well as the whales when they were whaling, the New England whalers went further and further out into the Atlantic initially, which was the way that you would go given the winds and so forth. And they found some whaling fields around the Azores in the around 1765. They began to whale there. And they also found that Azorians were eager to join their crews and find new economic opportunities. So it became very much the custom for New England whalers as they set out from New England on their whaling voyages to stop in the Azores to reprovision, but also to bring on additional crew members for the increasingly long voyages. In 1787, whalers began to first entered the Pacific around the tip of South America. And by around 1820 or so, they had reached all the way up to California and were beginning to call in San Francisco Bay in order to reprovision. I think it's interesting to note that Herman Melville in Moby Dick acknowledged the fact that the Azorians had really special talents when it came to the whaling business. It's likely that the first Azorians to set foot in Marin County likely did so at the beach in southern Sausalito, in Old Town in Sausalito, which was formerly called Whalers Cove. That's where the whaling ships would have pulled in to provision because Sausalito had the best water supply in the area, as well as supplies of timber that could be used for repairs to the whalers. And so it is likely that they came there, perhaps also brought the ships ashore and careened them for repairs. Of course, it looks quite a bit different today. Over the years, there have been really 2 distinct waves of immigration to the United States from the Azores. The first really got going in about the 1870s and then peaked in the 1910 to 1920 period, declined a bit, and then fell off for a few years until it peaked again in the 1970s. So why that hiatus? That has to do with American immigration policy in the early part of the 20th century. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge signed the Johnson-Reed Act, which imposed severe immigration quotas and other restrictions that affected, of course, not just immigrants from Portugal, but elsewhere as well. And that system was not really changed much until 1965 with the passage of the Hart-Celler Act Lyndon Johnson is shown here signing the act in 1965. However, regarding the Azorians, there was another event that dramatically impacted immigration, and that was the eruptions in the 1957 to 58 period of the so-called Capelinos volcano on the island of Fayal, which caused quite a bit of damage, both from earthquakes and ash from the volcano. Two senators, John Pastore from Rhode Island and a fellow named Kennedy from Massachusetts, both of whom had substantial numbers of Portuguese American constituents in their respective areas, came together to sponsor the Azorian Refugee Act of 1958, which provided a large number of special visas to Azorians who had been affected by the volcano and its aftermath. And so we had at that time another group of Azorians come who ended up bringing with them their traditions, and many of whom happily are still with us today here in Marin. So, dairies in Marin, what's that all about? Of course, in the Mexican period of California, the Mexican government decided to enter into a program of subdividing the property into large ranchos. And we're focusing here today primarily on the two in the southernmost Marin, the Rancho Sausalito, spelled with a C, that was granted to William Richardson in 1838, and the Rancho Corte Madera del Presidio, that was granted to John Reed in 1834. Unfortunately, we don't have a photo of John Reed, but we do have a photo of the adobe that he built in the Mill Valley area. In 1868 and 1874, there were two substantial developments in the transportation infrastructure that had a direct effect on dairies in Marin. The first was the opening of the ferry line between Sausalito and San Francisco, were initially serviced by the Princes, and that was in 1868. And then in 1874, the North Pacific Coast Railroad opened its line from Sausalito, running all the way up to Sonoma County. And the primary economic impetus behind that was, of course, the redwoods that were being logged in Sonoma. And that railroad was primarily used to bring those down to Sausalito, where they could be processed and then shipped by ferry over to San Francisco to help with the growing, the building of the growing city there. However, you can also see by this map that there are several references here along the route of the railroad to dairy land, because this was increasingly land that was being used for agricultural purposes. Initially, in the 1850s, when the dairy industry really got started in Marin, it was pretty much limited to the Point Reyes area, where there was excellent conditions for raising cattle. But of course, at that time, there was no real direct means of transportation into the market, which was in San Francisco. So most of the dairy product was either butter or cheese that was produced from the milk, which could be stored for a longer period. And then that would have been brought in by schooner from Drake's Bay into San Francisco for the market there. But of course, the opening of the rail line meant that you could get fresh dairy products into Sausalito in just a couple of hours, and then across to San Francisco quickly by ferry. And so that opened up this whole area for development of dairies. And develop they did. The This is a map of Marin showing some of the locations of dairies that have operated over the years. I work with another historian named Dewey Livingston on something called the Marin Dairy Project, in which we have tried to identify all of the dairy locations throughout Marin. And by now, we're up to just over 400. This map only shows about 340 of those. But of course, the remarkable thing to note from today's perspective is not just how many there were, but the fact that they were scattered everywhere throughout the county. There was really, we like to say, no place where you could go in Marin, almost no place that you'd be more than a mile or so from a dairy. And happily for our Portuguese history in Marin, dairy farming was something that the Azorians were very, very familiar with, since there are a lot of cows and a lot of dairy activity in the Azores. These are just a group of photos, recent photos from the Azores showing some happy cows grazing on the hillsides of the islands there. So you had the Azorians who started to come to California in increasing numbers, who had a variety of skills, but many of them knew how to operate dairies. And so that's what many of them did. Of course, some arrived with a little bit of capital, and they had a leg up, but others came with nothing. And if they wanted to get into the dairy business, they would start as a milker, working for wages on one of the dairies. Over time, they might be able to save some money, and at that point, they could invest in a few head of cattle, and then they might be able to become a partner in one of the dairy operations, because the dairies, in many cases, were operated by these informal partnerships, which might own the property, the real estate, but in many cases, particularly in the Tiburon case, did not own the underlying real estate. But you could be a partner in this partnership that would lease the property for purposes of operating the dairy. Some of them would become lead partners for a particular dairy operation, and they might stay on a particular dairy for a longer period of time, while other partners could come and go, because you just come and you go and you take your string of cattle with you. And then, of course, over time, for those who were even more successful, there was some opportunity to purchase the underlying dairy land and become a landowner, and in many cases, an absentee landowner, and leave the dairy business up to somebody else. But this is a map that shows the Portuguese dairies in southern Marin. And we're going to focus primarily in a moment on the ones here on the Tiburon and Strawberry Peninsula. But as you can see, in the old Rancho Sausalito and Rancho Corte Madera del Presidio, there were about almost 40 dairies, 40 dairy locations, where there would have been, and these were all operated at one point or another by Portuguese. So while in the rest of Marin, with its roughly 400 dairy sites, of course, there were many other sites that were operated by Portuguese. We estimate that perhaps around between 150 and 200 of those 400 were Portuguese. Nowhere else in the county was there this concentration that we find here in southern Marin, which is one of the reasons why it's so appropriate for Tiburon to have the dairy monument there. Interestingly, many of the schools here in southern Marin are on old dairy sites, and I spend part of my time now going around to some of the elementary schools and giving presentations on the history of the area, and I generally take my sidekick with me and talk a little bit about the dairy history of the sites on which the schools are located. As I hope many of you know, here in Marin, we have two Portuguese halls. The one that I'm involved with here in Sausalito, the IDESST, Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center, which was established in 1888. And then there's a second one in Novato, the IDESI, Portuguese Hall of Novato, that was established in 1906. There were two other halls in Marin in the past, one in Tamales and one in Point Reyes. Those closed a number of years ago. But there are also a number of other ones close by in the area. You can see here Sebastopol, Petaluma, Vallejo, and Benicia. Overall, in California in the past, there were roughly 150 of these organizations, extending all the way from the north of the state down to the San Diego area. Today, there are about just under 100 that remain active, and particularly out in the Central Valley, where there is a much larger Portuguese American concentration than there is here in Marin today. But I hope many of you may have attended the Holy Spirit Festival at one point or another, the Festa do Espírito Santo with its queens and parade and bands and sopas, a lunch that is served. That always happens in Sausalito on Pentecost Sunday, which is 7 Sundays after Easter Sunday, and in Novato the Sunday prior to Sausalito. So if you want, please mark that on your calendar for next year, and we'll look forward to seeing you. Of course, the dairy wall, the dairy mural wall on Tiburon joins a number of other items, places in Marin that have connections with our Portuguese heritage. In Sausalito, there are two. The Praça de Cascais that I mentioned earlier, right downtown, with this beautiful calçada compass rose mosaic that was installed in part by Marcos Paulino, who we saw earlier. And this was donated to Sausalito by the city of Cascais, our Sausalito's sister city. And then a second one at the base of Napa Street at the Napa Bridgeway intersection in Sausalito called Bolinar, a sculpture that was created in 1993 by an artist named John Liberton. And Bolinar is a Portuguese term, a verb that means to sail close to the wind. And the sculpture is intended to be three triangular sails that have been close hauled. And John intended those to reflect the sails, lantine sails of the caravelas, the crafts that were used in the late 1400s and early 1500s when the Portuguese began to go out into the Atlantic on their voyages of exploration that ultimately took them all the way to Japan. Then we have Da Silva Island that was named after Antonio Ferreira da Silva. Sadly, the firm that decided to develop Da Silva Island ended up calling it De Silva, which is not correct, but it should be Da Silva. Over as you go out to Stinson Beach, passing through Muir Beach, you'll be paralleling the Diaz Ridge Trail. Jim Diaz was a former president of the IDESST and a rancher that had a ranch up along the Panoramic Highway. And the Park Service named the trail that runs from the Panoramic Highway down to Muir Beach, right next to the Pelican Inn and the Golden Gate Dairy there, the Diaz Ridge Trail. Over in Mill Valley, as you come along East Blythedale, you'll intersect Roque Morais or Roque Morais Drive. Roque was another dairy farmer. He was actually from the island of Pico. but he operated the Alto Dairy, which was along Camino Alto there, behind Whole Foods on East Blythedale, for several years, and then ultimately managed to acquire the property that became the Enchanted Knolls subdivision. And so when they developed it, they named a street after him. That's a picture of Rock with his wife and daughter. We did an article, I worked on an article a few years ago with Lissa McKee of Tam Valley on about Rock. And then as you go further north in Marin, along Highway 101, you come first to the Freitas Parkway and Terra Linda. That was the site of the Freitas home ranch that was owned by Manuel Teixeira de Freitas, who was perhaps one of the most eminent Portuguese Americans here in Marin County. He had not only the home ranch, but 5 other ranches, dairy ranches in Marin over the years. But when they developed the home ranch, his family was given the opportunity to name it, and his daughter decided on Terra Linda, which is beautiful land in Portuguese, not Spanish. Spanish would be Tierra Linda, but this is Terra Linda, Portuguese. A bit further north, you actually go by 2 Silveira ranches that were owned by Antonio Faustin Silveira. His family still owns them. One is across from Marinwood, just south of St. Vincent's there. That is, and then the second one is just as you cross the Sonoma Marin border, where you'll see the Silveira Ranch Road sign. There's, unfortunately, they're not dairies any longer, although they still are running some cattle on the properties. This is just a list. I won't go over it, but there are a number of other locations in Marin that have connections to our Portuguese heritage, and here's a list of at least some of them. So turning now to the dairies on Tiburon, of course, they all have something to do with the Reed family and its members. I'm not going to get into the whole Reed family, but certainly some of them were involved in the dairies, not directly in the dairy operations, but in leasing the property that was operated, where the Portuguese lessees were operating the dairies on Tiburon. I should point out particularly Clotilda Reed, since her name will come up. There were 3 John Reeds. John Thomas, who was the original grantee of the Rancho Corte Madera del Presidio, 1834. His son, John Joseph Reed, who had both an illegitimate child, Clotilda, and a son who was legitimate by his married wife, Carlotta Suarez, whose name also was John Paul Reed. And then, of course, there were the Hilarita Reed, who married Benjamin Lyford. We'll talk a little bit about them. And then Maria Inez Reed, who married Thomas Defebach. We're not going to talk about them, since their property and the dairies associated with that property was on the west side of Highway 101. So here is a view of the Tiburon Peninsula, with the town of Tiburon down here at the bottom, Belvedere. So we're looking due west over towards Mill Valley along the spine of the peninsula. So as you can see, there were 6 dairies along here on both sides of the Tiburon Peninsula and on the Strawberry Peninsula here. The Ring Dairy, the Linda and Hogg Dairy, which was associated with a cod fishing facility there, the Hilarita Dairy, the Little Reed Dairy, which is where the mural wall is located, the Big Reed Dairy, and then the Eagle or Lyford Dairy on the Strawberry Peninsula. I also just a couple of days ago, this article appeared. There was a controversy about a property owner along Paradise Drive who had two mini cows who wanted to keep them and possibly bring in a couple of more for milk production. There was a brouhaha. Neighbors complained. Some neighbors complained. Many were supportive of the cows. But happily, for those of us who like dairies, they finally, just a few days ago, received permission to keep the cows on the property. So there are at least two cows on Tiburon today, and hopefully one or two more in the future. This is another view. We're just going to really focus on these four dairies, but another view here looking south to north. And I included this view because Parker Pringle, who is another historian active here in southern Marin, very involved with our railroad history, put on this map the routes of the railroad lines that came through southern Marin. One coming down here on the Tiburon Peninsula, past the dairies, as we'll see in just a moment, the Big Reed Dairy, past the Little Reed Dairy, past Hillerita. And then the original North Pacific Coast Railroad, which came here from Sausalito, and then actually crossed Richardson's Bay to the tip of Strawberry and went up past the Eagle Dairy. We'll see that in a moment. That route was closed, though, just a few years later, and when they opened the Alto tunnel, and at that point, the route of the train came up this way, where the blue line is. So the first one is the Hillerita Dairy. This is a view of it in the 1940s. And this is a view of the same area today with the school right here along Lyford Drive. This is Tiburon Boulevard coming along here. The old dairy residence that was used, the Avelas were the last Portuguese family to operate the dairy here. That was their home. There was also in the back what they call the calf barn, which was right about here. That was disassembled a few years ago, but happily preserved and is now over at the Golden Gate Dairy in Muir Beach. But that's that view today, and then roughly the same two views together. Moving along, here's the picture that we've seen earlier of the Little Reed Ranch in 1931 with Tiburon Boulevard coming through here. And you can see here pretty clearly the rail line coming along here on its way into Tiburon, where the dairy wall is right about here. And of course, this is today called the Old Rail Trail. Here is the same view today. Again, Tiburon Boulevard coming up here, Del Mar School, and the Old Rail Trail with the approximate location of the mural shown by the star. And the two pictures together. So the dairy buildings actually here would have been right down here in the ball field right along Tiburon Boulevard, with some of the buildings on the other side right here. So the third dairy we're looking at is the Big Reed, Little Reed. This is the Big Reed. And we have to have two pictures of this because I wanted to include both the old barn of the Big Reed Dairy, which is right here. So this picture is taken from the hillside looking south towards Sausalito down here. This is the Strawberry Peninsula here. And then a second picture at the bottom here, which was taken from right about here, because you can see the rail line coming right around here on this curve. And so this picture at the bottom would have been taken here looking across the hills to the to the west. And that one was taken in about 1884 and shows the Reed mansion, the Reed's family home up here on the hill. So you had the mansion, and then you had the actual dairy, which was some distance away. Here are two counterpart pictures. Again, one looking south, one looking west, and then the comparisons of the two. So these two are counterparts, and these two are counterparts. So the dairy barn would have been right about here in this picture, kind of straddling the road, and the old Reed mansion here would have been up on the hillside, right about here. And you can see kind of the curve of the rail would have been right along here. Actually, this tennis court is built right on the old railroad right of way here, and then it would have curved around the corner here, gone through the tunnel and on. And then finally, the Eagle Dairy, the Lyfords, Benjamin and Hilary Lyford's dairy, with their famous the Lyford House, which was here. Some of you probably know that was later put on a barge and moved across the bay here, where it is now part of the Audubon Refuge on property that was donated by Rose da Fonte Rodrigues, another Portuguese individual. But this picture is from 1888, and you can see the original North Coast Pacific rail line coming up here that was, of course, subsequently discontinued, much to the Lyfords' displeasure, since they were pretty much cut off. And then here is the same view today with Bay Club. You can see there it's tennis courts, probably right on about the location of the dairy, and the two pictures juxtaposed. So, of course, we talk a lot about the places and the real estate and pictures of the buildings and the dairies. But, of course, all of these would not have operated, not have existed without the hard work of hundreds and hundreds of Portuguese individuals who came here from the Azores, primarily from the Azores, and worked on these dairies. This is just a few of the families and individuals who operated the dairies on Tiburon. Anton Souza here, we don't know the names, unfortunately, of the three gentlemen with him, but he was the lead partner on the Hilarita dairy for many years in the late 1800s. Pedro Silveira operated the Eagle Dairy for the Lyford family for many years. Manuel Borges, actually, he had a dairy where Tam Valley Elementary School is today, but also worked on the Little Reed Dairy. Manuel Silva operated the Big Reed Dairy. He was also one of the presidents of the IDESST. So again, the close connection between the dairies and the Portuguese halls. And I should have said, I think I neglected to do so when I was talking about the festas. But at the time of the festas, of course, all of these dairies, these many dairies around southern Marin would donate cattle. And so they would round them up and bring them into Sausalito. Same thing was done in Novato, of course. And they would have provided the meat for the festa celebration. John Bernard and his family, he worked on both the Little Reed and the Hilarita dairy over the years. I mentioned the Avelas. Joseph Avella his family was the last one to operate the Hilarita dairy. That was in the 1950s. And then finally, I'll mention Mary Brazil, because of all of the dairies on the Tiburon Peninsula that we looked at. The only one, though, where the real property, was ultimately owned by a Portuguese individual was the case of the Little Reed Dairy. And it was Mary Brazil, who was not an unmarried woman, who owned it. And she got to that position because she was a very close companion of Clotilda Reed, who we saw earlier in the Reed family tree. But Clotilda died in 1940, and she, in her will, allegedly, she left the Little Reed Ranch to Mary Brazil. Mary had previously, since about the mid-1920s, actually operated the dairy there. She was a partner in the dairy. But in 1940, as I said, Clotilda bequeathed it to Mary. Some litigation ensued. Other heirs contested that, but after some litigation, Mary ultimately prevailed. So for a few years anyway, before she ultimately sold it, she was the sole Portuguese owner of one of the Tiburon dairies. So I appreciate very much your interest in this program. Please do feel free, if you have any questions about any of the matters that have been covered here, to drop me an email. You can reach me at history@idesst.org. Thank you very much.